It looks like something's missing under there. Good afternoon. This is going to be a different video for a different car. This video is going to be on the oil pump replacement on a Mark 6 Volkswagen TSI. This is actually my daily driver car, and recently I was having oil pressure issues where the oil pressure light would come on the highway, and it was intermittent, and I really wasn't sure what it was, if it was an oil pressure sensor, or it was just low on oil, or the oil pump was actually going bad, or it was rod bearings, main bearings. It could be a multitude of different things. So I decided to do the inevitable, which was buy an oil pressure tester, and hooked it up. And well, it's never good when you buy one of those, because you want to know the answer, but you really don't want to know the answer. So ended up finding out the answer, and it looked like it was low oil pressure at higher RPM, which would mean, to me, insufficient flow, which would then drive the pressure. So I ended up taking out the oil pump, and this video is going to cover the removal, the installation, and a breakdown of the pump. Just kind of want to go into overview what tools I ended up using for this particular job as well. So I used the T45 3/8 drive to remove the oil pan bolt. On this particular TSI engine, for some reason, this is a T45. My other TSI was a 19mm, so I don't know. They're a year apart, but they have different oil pan bolts. That's what I used to remove the oil. I used a T30, I believe, yeah, a T30 with this smaller extension as well as the larger extension to remove all the oil pan bolts. I used just a 1/4-inch drive there, and the pick to help with the guide or the tensioner. Also used a 15/16 socket because I don't have the metric equivalent for the actual oil pressure sensor to take that out of the oil filter flange housing. And then this kit from Napa, and I'll put all this stuff in the description, as well as the mini little impact gun that rocks the bolts out real quick. And then initially when I did this, I just checked everything, and I ended up using this Optimum Black RTV. And I'll tell you what, this stuff did not work so well compared to the regular black, or they have Permatex has another one. It's called Right Stuff. That stuff is killer, and it basically seals anything. So I'm just going to use the regular ultra black when I put this pan back on. And then aside from that, for scraping the pan and to get the gunk off, I just used basically a flat scraper or spatula to remove all the excess silicone from the previous pan, and then I used a wire brush to basically scrub it all off, as well as a razor blade to prepare the bottom end of the block to accept the silicone. So I don't have those shown, obviously, but that's what I used. So that's all you need to use to do this job, to replace the oil pump. Okay, so I did want to show a breakdown of the gauge that I ended up using to check the oil pressure. This particular one I bought from Napa. It was about 80 bucks. Came with a bunch of different fittings, and you have to kind of conjure up what works best for your application. But basically, if you were going to check a Volkswagen engine for oil pressure, especially in the oil ports, you will end up using an M10 type thread. And then obviously there's a really long tube there attached to the gauge. So in the Mark 6 TSI, you actually have a nice location right there where your oil pressure sensor is, right under the oil filter. So all you have to do is remove that thing, and then plumb the oil pressure gauge in, and you can run the engine and put the gauge actually up towards the window there, and you can rev it up and see exactly what's happening. So that's what I ended up doing. I'm not going to show that in this particular video, but that's what ended up happening. And so anyway, for the gauge, some of the symptoms, what I ended up doing is looking at the gauge, and around idle we had about 25 psi, and then revved up to about 2,000 RPMs, and the oil was relatively cold, so I would actually expect higher pressure than that. it was around 30, 32, somewhere in there, which is under the factory spec according to the manual. I believe it's 38 pounds minimum at 2,000 RPMs at 80 degrees C, so I was a little bit cooler than that. I didn't have the engine fully warmed, but the oil pressure generally when the oil is cold, it has a higher viscosity, which then would drive a higher oil pressure. So inherently I thought I would see more than the 38 PSI even at minimum, but I ended up not seeing that, which would insist that there is a flow issue in the pump and it's not producing as much oil flow, which then therefore drives the pressure. So that's the explanation of the gauge. So if you buy one of these and you end up using the gauge and you look at it, this is like basically any sort of test you don't want to see the results for. When you run this and you see something lower than you would want to see, that's when, well, you know the answer, but it's an unfortunate answer that you don't want to have to deal with. So that's the tester itself. So then for the oil pump, there's a couple different components. I kind of have things set up here on a rag and just drying out from the last couple days because I took this out a couple days ago. But essentially, you have to remove the oil pan. That's the first piece. And there's a multitude of bolts around the outside, and it's relatively simple. It comes right off. There's actually a really good video ECS does, ECS tuning, to remove it. So I don't really want to go through the removal process, but you basically just remove all the bolts and drop the pan out. There's nothing that impedes you from doing that. It's really simple. The next piece that you're going to have, and I will show this all assembled, or the reversal, is going to be this oil baffle, which is above, right above the pan, which blocks the pump. So you'll have 3 bolts that you'll take off to remove that. And then you will gain access to the actual oil pump itself. And generally your, where's the pickup tube on this thing? Here it is. Generally your pickup tube would be attached. I removed it. Interestingly enough, the Volkswagen TSI uses a plastic pickup tube. You do want to inspect the inside of that just to make sure there's no giant chunks of metal, debris blocking it, and then you can look in the inside of the tube as well. I ended up soaking this in some wax and grease remover just to kind of remove any contamination. But then I went to actually inspecting the pump because that is what appears to be the culprit in the first place. So I wanted to check and make sure all the pressure relief valves, all the balls, the springs were all there, as well as the gear drive itself seemed to be intact. So if you are interested in how the pump works, I already removed all the screws around the housing. The TSI is a gear-driven unit that attaches to the crank. So if you remove the pump, you do not have to do anything with the timing. You can actually remove it, and I'll show exactly how to do that in a second. But that's the pump. It looks pretty standard. It's got the flow, the in, the out, the pickups. It has the pressure reliefs, which are in here. There's a spring and ball detent. So basically, if it sees overpressure, it dumps all that oil back into the pan, which acts as a reservoir and should net to 0 pressure. So that's why the oil actually drains out. And I think when these pumps fail, they can either fail in 2 ways, which would be in the gear drive itself or in the pressure control unit, which is that ball and spring contraption. And frankly, I'm not exactly sure what this thing is, but this looks like another flow type adjuster or pressure adjuster, but I'm not sure. I've not seen that. Like a VR6 pump is a lot simpler than this. But anyway, hang on one second. So when you remove the top of the unit, so you would take this off like that, you end up with two halves here. The top half has the gear and 1 drive, and then that would be attached to the actual timing component itself. And you can see how that kind of drives and spins, right? Then the other is kind of just like an idler gear, basically, but this helps create the pressure and the flow actually in the pump. So all in all, inside the pump itself, this pump had 156,000 miles on it at this point. Everything looked good. There was no real scoring. It seemed pretty smooth, but But I don't know, that's where I'm kind of concerned, and hopefully it's just the pump and it's not the bearings or something like that in the motor. But if it was the bearings, I'd expect to have really low oil pressure at idle as well, and I have really good pressure at idle. I just don't have pressure on the higher RPM, which would indicate a flow issue. But basically you could take this gear out. It's all removable, so you take the gear out and you can see there's just like an idler hole basically in there, and then here's where the fluid kind of creates the pump effect. That's pretty much it. These things are relatively simple. There's not a whole lot to an oil pump. It's basically the heartbeat of your engine if you want to keep it running and have longevity. So it's important to make sure you change your oil, especially in these direct injection cars. I always change the oil on this car every 6,500, even though I think the recommended is 10,000. My other GTI has 256,000 miles in it on this point, and I gave it to my friend recently, and he's still driving it. So that's the breakdown of the pump. When I get the new one, I'll explain. I'll show in comparison and just check everything, and that'll be another part in the video. So I did end up getting the new pump today. So basically, here's the new one. Everything looks to be identical. This one you can see a nice shiny ball for the pressure relief, as well as the springs all there, your pickup, and I ended up purchasing a new O-ring as well for the pickup tube, just to be safe. And now I'm going to put this back into the car and hopefully get this thing thrown together and see if we still continue to have oil pressure issues at higher RPMs. Okay, so I'm getting ready to put the pump back in. I've already cleaned off the entire gasket area or sealant surface, and then I use Scotch-Brite and stuff to clean that up one final time. And then I'm going to use this microfiber and just basically wipe off any excess drips or dribbles before I put the pump back in. And based on the angle, you can see I have to loop the pump around the chain. I have to pull the tensioner back towards the front of the motor so I can loop the pulley or the sprocket into the chain and get everything lined up. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. One thing to note as well, there are two dowels that come on the new pump in the opposing corners. On my old pump, one actually stayed in, and then the other one stayed in the girdle pan or girdle plate. So I had to remove that, and all you need to do is use some pliers, and you end up just squeezing the dowel and pulling it out, whichever surface it ends up staying on. But the new pump does come with both dowels, so just make sure when you go to put it back in that both dowels are either out of the girdle plate, so the new pump has them. You can just go ahead and reinstall it. And the other thing I'm going to do is actually prime the oil pump. I'm going to put some oil into the pickup, kind of get it in the gear and things, so when it goes to start, it's not like a dry start and it immediately can start sucking up oil from the pan. The other thing to take note too, once you put a little oil in there and prime the pump, you want to make sure you put the pickup tube on before you put the pump in. And the pickup can only go one way. There's only one bolt that holds it in. So you just make sure that that's in there first before you go ahead and try and put the pump in.
to see how easy it is to switch and save on renter's insurance.
Okay, so we have the pump in here. I'm going to show you how to magically get this thing in. Okay, so there are 4 bolts for the pump. There's 2 in the front here, right where they go into the motor. There's 1 on the back side right here, and there's 1 in the front right up here, which is really hard to see because there's a shadow. Then you have your chain sprocket assembly with the tensioner, and then there's the dowels on the opposite ends. So what you want to do, if you can see it from the other part, you want to take the pump, basically position it into the chain link, and then if you use this pick tool, which I had mentioned earlier, you're going to take it and hook it on the inside of the tensioner guide. And then what you do is you can pull, and you'll watch the tensioner move. You can pull it and hold it out, and that gives you just enough slack to be able to get the sprocket or the chain onto the sprocket. And then as you get that in, you want to articulate it up and push, and the dowel pins will kind of set the pump into where it needs to be. And then if you watch, I screwed this one in first, this outer one, and because it wants to pull down and articulate back, that one seems to hold it well enough that you can position the others and then get the other 3 remaining bolts in. The bolt for the pickup actually goes through the baffle pan that goes over all this, so you don't have to worry about this bolt yet, but you should be able to see everything lines up. It's all in position, and then you tighten up those 4 bolts, and then you're ready to put the baffle pan on, and then you're ready to put the oil pan on. So that's kind of the secret. I'd say that's the hardest part, is really knowing how to pry that back and remove the pump outside of the chain, and then bringing it back into the chain and getting all the bolts tightened up. Everything else after this is going to be a cakewalk. So frankly, I'm not even sure what the torque specs are on these oil pump bolts. They're like an M6 by 1, so they're pretty small bolts. It's probably something like 7 to 14 inch-pounds, something like that. Most likely like the same torque as a cam cap for a Volkswagen. But I'm just going to use this 1/4 inch ratchet here and just kind of grab it at the head of the ratchet, and I just make sure that they're tight. That way they're not going to come loose, especially before you put that baffle on, because once the baffle's on, you can't actually access these bolts. Not the most scientific, and I'm sure people are going to flip out that you didn't torque it, but I've done a lot of oil pumps in many different cars, and they haven't been an issue if you tighten them up like that. So I'm just going to keep doing it. You can't mess with results. Okay, so there's basically 3 bolts for the baffle pan, and I'll show those once they're going in. You're going to have a long one that's going to be the center of the baffle, which is then going to go through the pickup. And then you have 2 short ones which are on the end of the baffle pan, and I'll show them as we go in. The remaining bolts here are going to be all for the oil pan. I'm not sure how many there are off the top of my head, but these three are the ones you want to make sure you keep separate when you remove the baffle. And then also so when you put it in, you use the same bolts that go in. One thing to note too about the baffle pan, there is this like breather or baffle assembly that can be removed. That's actually replaceable. I didn't spec that when you take your baffle pan off. Just make sure it's intact and all there before you put the whole thing back together. And basically you could see the two of the bolts, and then the third one there. There's going to be the two holes there on the opposite sides of the baffle, and you're going to have the one in the center, which corresponds to those three bolts that I just had spoke about. So I'm going to reposition here and get this baffle pan back in. So when you're putting this on, the this little baffle assembly that I just spoke about is going to go towards the back tranny side of the motor. So basically there's little, let's see if I can get these on the camera. There's actually little tabs on the baffle pan that go inside the casting of the girdle plate. So you can see how they line up, and then everything should just go right together. And the other thing you want to watch out for too is when you're obviously putting this pan up, if you have excess oil in it, it could drip in your face or your eyes. So be careful of that. You could always wear goggles, or if you wear glasses like me, it kind of protects you most of the time. But you know, something to think about. So you can kind of click it in, it kind of stays put where it needs to be. And then again, this center bolt. So once your baffle pan's on, the long bolt out of the three is going to go in this. Let's see if I can get this on the camera. It's going to go in this center hole here. It's right above where the pickup is. So the long one goes there, and then the two short ones are going to go on the opposite side of that other baffle in the rear, which I'll show in a minute. So you can see these. This is that little baffle, and there's a bolt right there, and the other one is on the opposite side over here. And then with the baffle installed, it looks like that from the bottom. You can see the oil pump here, the pickup, and then the rest of the baffle and that other internal oil pump or oil pan baffle. So now I'm going to silicone the pan and get the pan back on. But now, so I have a wire brush that I use, but you can clean the pan surface up, get all the excess silicone off of it.
If you have a wizard wheel, you can do that too. I just said I wiped it out, but... Wipe it out again now that I
cleaned all that excess silicone off. You really want to make sure you get this thing looking like new, because you don't want all that like silicone or debris or whatever's in there. You don't want the oil pickup tube essentially picking that up and clogging it up, because then you're going to be pulling the pan back off. Make sure it's nice and clean, and that's that. So basically you got your cleaned up pan, all the surfaces are clean. You want to make sure too that you get this excess silicone and things out of these grooves, because that's where you end up putting the silicone in, and that's what seals against the base of the motor, or that girdle plate on this engine. And for this particular seal job, I'm going to use RTV Ultra Black. I tried this other one the other day, which was this Optimum Black instead of the Ultra Black. And, well, when I still had the oil pressure issue, when I thought the pickup was clogged or something related to that, I used that, and it didn't seem to work too well. It seemed still wet when I took it off, and I had been running the motor for a while, and it had sat for a good 40 minutes or so before I actually put the oil in the engine. So for some reason it stayed really wet, and I've never seen that before with silicone. So perhaps I just didn't get enough time to dry, or it was cold in the garage and it wasn't really optimum temperature for the RTV to vulcanize. But you know, it is what it is. So I'm gonna go back to the regular black RTV and just call it a day. Okay, I think I finally got this gasket maker, this RTV, to come out of the tube. I guess not. Normally I would use one of these things and put it on the tube, but for some reason this tube is having a major malfunction. So I just poked a hole in it, boogered it all on there. I'm going to wipe it kind of thin with my finger, prepare the pan, and then I'm going to put the pan on. Again, this isn't, I don't know that there's a wrong way to do this. Factory, they just lay a nice little bead, and when you put it on, it creates a nice flow over each edge, which is what ideally you want to do. But in situations like this where the RTV has really just made me angry, I put a hole in the side and just, like I said, boogered it on there. And I'm going to spread it around like peanut butter, and then put the pan on. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, so finally the pan's all on. All the bolts are tight. And I know I did a haphazard silicone job, but basically if you look at your silicone, you can see if it squeezes out just a little bit at the top of the edge of the pan, then you know you got enough in there. That'll tell you have a good, you can see a little bit there, a good bead all the way around, and it shouldn't be too much to where it's folding over on the inside of the pan, and all the screws are basically filled. When I went around, I made sure to get all the excess out of the screw holes before I even put it in, but then when it was in, I made sure that some of the extra excess was actually removed as well before I put the screws in, and then wiped it down. And obviously the pan is pretty oily on the outside, which is why it's so shiny. But like I said, ECS has a really good video on how to remove the pan and reassemble and all that stuff. So if you really just want to know how to do the pan, I'd suggest going to ECS's website or go on their video on YouTube here, and you'll be able to get it. So that basically wraps up the oil pump installation as well as the pan, and then gonna let this sit and dry for about an hour, and then come back, fill it up with oil, start it, drive it, make sure I have no oil pressure light. And if I don't, then we are good to go, and hopefully that is the case. Okay, so this is the moment of truth. Actually, this is the second moment of truth because I already started it and moved it. However, I did wait overnight to let the silicone dry just to be sure, because it was a little chilly last night and my garage is not heated all the time. So I let it dry overnight, and I started it up, and we seem to have good success. There's no oil pressure warning at this point. I did drive it around to get it somewhat warm. As you can see, the temperature is almost at 190, and past 4,000, 5,000, there's no pressure warning or oil pressure light. Prior to doing the pump, there was oil pressure light, like as soon as you would start to drive it off of idle, and then it would stay on until you shut the car off. But it seems to be running great. The car is actually even more quiet now. Well, engine wise it's more quiet, which is to be expected, because I'm sure at even low speed the pump is producing more flow, which then in turn is producing more pressure. So I think overall it's pretty good. So if I revved it up to 2,000 or 3,000, you'll see that there should be no light. Yep. And normally I would have already had a pressure signal or oil light flashing. And inside the car, the engine just sounds much more healthy. So that concludes the video. This all worked out. Engineering principles always are good to follow. And thanks for watching. Hopefully this helps somebody with an oil pressure issue.